Okay, so I think everything is good. Okay, so let us then start. We start with doing the homage to the Buddha 3 times, the salutation. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, so good morning, everybody, and sorry to be a little bit awkward today, but we've shifted over to the new mode of conducting the class, first time in 3 years that we're having an in-person class. And so we're continuing with our reading of the Anguttara Nikaya. And now I'm going to share the screen. And so you can see the screen?
Yes, Bhante.
Okay, good. Okay, so we've been going through now the Book of Fives, just taking selected discourses. And now we come to a pair of suttas which are very similar. There's just one sentence that differs between the two of them. And the title of the sutta is One Who Dwells in the Dhamma, or it could also be taken One Who Dwells by the Dhamma, or One Who Lives by the Dhamma. And we have to remember that the way this is going to be expounded is in terms of the bhikkhu, or the monk, or the monastic. It's not intended to be a general statement about how any follower of Buddhism dwells in the Dhamma, since the way of dwelling in the Dhamma will be different for a lay person and a monastic. Okay, so this is sutta number 73. We have actually 2 suttas that are pairs, that form a pair, 73 and 74. Okay, so the first, the Buddha says, he opens, or some monk comes to the Buddha and says, one who dwells in the Dhamma, one who dwells in the Dhamma. So apparently this was a familiar statement in the Buddha's time, a way of praising a monk. And so then he asks, in what way is a monk one who dwells in the Dhamma, or one who lives by the Dhamma? Yeah, the Pali would be a little bit ambivalent. It would be Dhamma Vihari, which can be taken either way, as one who lives, and Dhamma can be taken as instrumental by the Dhamma, or locative, one who dwells in the Dhamma. Okay, so the Buddha answers the question. First, he says, here a monk learns the Dhamma, and then he mentions 9 different types of texts that were circulated during the Buddha's time. We don't have to go into the distinctions between them, but I just have provisional translations of them here. But the important point here is that this monk passes the day in learning the Dhamma, that is, in studying the Dhamma, listening to the Dhamma from as others teach it. We have to remember in the Buddha's time, they didn't have printed texts. And so one has to learn the Dhamma by going to a teacher and hearing the teacher expounded orally. And then once you hear the Dhamma from others, then you learn the Dhamma by reciting it to oneself and memorizing it and imprinting it upon the mind. But once printed books started to appear, then there came a major shift in the way monastic communities approached the learning of the Dhamma. And as a result of the printing of books, there came a shift in the weight from learning a little bit and then engaging in practice. Once you have libraries of books, then there comes a rise in pariyatti, which is book learning or scriptural study, as against pati practice. But in the Buddha's day, you see, in order to learn the Dhamma, you have to go to a teacher, hear it orally, and then memorize it, which takes a lot of effort. So those who specialized in learning would devote a lot of their time to listening to teachings from teachers and memorizing it, trying to imprint it on their memory. But it's because there were groups of monks that were dedicated to that task that the teachings were able to be preserved and transmitted for some 300, 400 years until, they say, in the 1st century BC in Sri Lanka, the texts for the first time, at least as a canonical collection, were written down on ola leaves. What had happened in Sri Lanka, one thing that had happened around the 1st century BC is that there was a famine and many, many people died, including many monks who were specialized in the scriptures and memorizing the scriptures. And because of that, the Sangha, the monastic community, was afraid that the whole transmission, or at least the transmission of many texts, would have been terminated if in the future there was another famine and monks who were responsible for preserving the texts died off, those texts would be permanently lost. And so the Sangha made the decision to write the text down, to commit them to the written mode. And so in this place near Matale, the town of Matale, called the Aloka Vihara, the Alu Vihara, the monks collected at a large assembly, and they had specialists in writing who would take ola leaves and special kind of pen and then inscribe the text onto ola leaves. In fact, even today in the Aloka Vihara, the Alu Vihara near Matale, they still maintain this tradition of writing the text down on ola leaves. When I visited Sri Lanka in 2006, we stopped off at the Alu Vihara and we saw the monks writing the text down on ola leaves, and one of them wrote a portion of text on an ola leaf and gave it to me. I think I still have it. I think it's at Bodhi Monastery where I was living earlier. Okay, so here we have the case of the monk who spends all his time, he passes the day in learning the Dhamma. And of course, learning the Dhamma is essential, crucial, because in order to practice successfully, one has to have some knowledge, some understanding of the Dhamma. To gain insight, one needs knowledge and understanding of the Dhamma. But here we have the case of the monk who passes the whole day learning the Dhamma and neglects, this is the important point, neglects seclusion and does not devote himself to internal serenity of mind. This is ajitang ceto samita. So this is the practice of, basically it's the practice of the training for the attainment of samadhi, unification of mind, the collectedness or composure of mind, the foundation for gaining samadhi and the jhanic attainments. And so this is called a monk who is absorbed in learning, but not one who dwells in the Dhamma. And it seems that the Buddha is criticizing this monk by saying that he's not dwelling in the Dhamma. But again, we have to remember, as I said, that learning the Dhamma is an essential aspect in one's spiritual training. And for anybody, I say, whether it's a layperson or a monastic who wants to follow the Dhamma seriously, and be able to gain some comprehensive knowledge of the Dhamma, it's of critical importance to learn the Dhamma, at least to read an assortment, a selection of suttas, to be able to get a clear knowledge, a clear understanding of the fundamental principles of the Buddha's teaching. So the problem is not in learning the Dhamma, but the problem is with neglecting to go apart into seclusion, into a quiet, secluded place in which one can devote oneself to the training of the mind. In this case, the training of the mind in samatha, in the training for samadhi. And this becomes, I would say, one problem that emerges in the Sangha, in the monastic community, that we have a lot of monks and maybe nuns as well, maybe fewer nuns, but more monks, who just devote themselves to study and learning, become scriptural experts, but they don't undertake the practice of meditation. And when that happens, it leads, one of the factors that leads to the decline of the Dhamma. And often when monks just become learned, full of intellectual knowledge, they can become proud of their knowledge, engage in debates and disputes with other monks or scriptural specialists, but the transmission of the living transmission of the practice declines and eventually dies out. Okay, the second case, we have the monk who teaches that, in this case, the monk is one who teaches the Dhamma to others in detail as he has heard it and learned it, and he passes the day conveying the Dhamma to others, but again, he neglects seclusion and doesn't devote himself to training for this Chaito Samatha, the serenity of mind. And again, teaching the Dhamma is, again, something of critical importance. So the Buddha says that, he praises those monks and nuns who not only learn the Dhamma for themselves, not only practice for themselves, but also teach and train others in the Dhamma. And so if there was no teaching, communication of the Dhamma to others, again, the lineage of teaching would die out. So it's the fact that there were monastics who were learned in the Dhamma and then taught the next generation, who in turn will teach the next generation, that the Dhamma was able to continue over some 2,500 years. So the problem here, again, is not in teaching the Dhamma as such, but it's neglecting seclusion and not devoting oneself to this training of the mind in samatha. Okay, the third, so again, this is called a monk who's absorbed in communication, or you could say in teaching, but not one who dwells in the Dhamma. Okay, the third case, we have the monk who recites the Dhamma in detail as he has heard it and learned it, and passes the day in recitation. So again, recitation is an essential step in learning the Dhamma, especially in the Buddha's time. It was absolutely indispensable because there were no, as I said, no written texts. And so to know the Dhamma well, you're not able to turn to a written text, to a published book and open it and consult it, but you have to bear it in memory by reciting it. And so the regular practice in the process of learning, you learn the texts from a teacher, you imprint it upon the mind as the teacher conveys it to you, and then to ensure that you preserve it, that you're able to retain it, you do regular recitation of the text. And the way this is traditionally done, at least in the Theravada Buddhist countries, when monks learn the text during the day, then in the evening, it will be like walkways, sakman walkways, where they go walking back and forth the day is turned dark, as the evening is set in. They walk back and forth, reciting the text over and over, sometimes in pairs, so that as one monk is reciting, the monk next to him can check him to make sure that he's reciting correctly. And so it's through this practice of recitation, it took place over many generations after the Buddha's passing, that the monks were able to preserve the teachings fairly accurately. But also, I think what would have taken place during this process of recitation, that monks can get their memories mixed up a little bit and then transmit or teach the Dhamma that they've memorized to somebody in the next generation with a little bit of error slipping in, and they'll convey it to the next generation, again with some slight errors coming in, like transmission errors. And in that way, we get in the different collections of early Buddhist texts, like coming from the Theravada school, Savastivada school, what are some of the others that have died out? The Mula Savastivada school, maybe Mahasangika school, little differences in the texts, which could have come through differences through the process of memorization and recitation, and then in teaching to others. Okay, so we have recitation. So then the Buddha says this is called the monk who is absorbed in recitation, but not one who dwells in the Dhamma. Okay, then the fourth case, we have the monk who ponders, examines, and mentally investigates the Dhamma that he has learned. So this is the one who's maybe more intellectually inclined and likes to investigate the implications of the teaching. Well, how does this particular discourse connect with this discourse? What is the meaning of this discourse? How should we understand these phrases, these expressions? And so in this way, maybe through examining and investigating and reflecting on the teaching, then we have the monks who start to form systematic versions of the teaching. Maybe this would mark the beginning of like commentaries on the teaching. And so then the Buddha says, this monk, he passes a day thinking about the teaching, reflecting on the teaching, but again, he neglects seclusion and doesn't devote himself to internal serenity of mind. So he says that this is the monk who is absorbed in thought, in thinking, in reflection, maybe in systematic thinking about the teaching, but not one who dwells in the Dhamma. So here we have 4 ways in which monks can conduct themselves that are sort of implicitly being criticized by the Buddha, but not criticized in themselves, but criticized because the monks in each of these cases devote themselves fully to these other activities at the cost of, at the sacrifice of their own personal cultivation. And so each of these cases, the Buddha says, is a case in which the monk is not one who is truly dwelling in the Dhamma. Though I would actually have some reservations about this. I would really say that a monk who is fully devoted to learning, to teaching, well, maybe we should come to the 5th case. Okay, so in the fifth case, this is going to be the one who actually dwells in the Dhamma. Okay, so here we have the monk who learns the Dhamma, but does not pass the day, and then I put in brackets, solely, exclusively, entirely learning the Dhamma. And we could also add that we have here the monk not only who learns the Dhamma, but who teaches to others, who recites the Dhamma, who investigates and examines the Dhamma. So he could engage in all of those activities. Those are critical, essential activities. But the important point is that he does not pass the entire day engaged exclusively in those activities. So he doesn't neglect seclusion, but devotes himself to internal serenity of mind. So it is in this way, the Buddha says, that the monk is one who dwells in the Dhamma. So that is the essential key to dwelling in the Dhamma, is engaging in seclusion, resorting to seclusion, which means going off to a secluded place where one is sort of not embroiled in the company of others, even if it's an individual room, a private room. And there one devotes oneself to training the mind to gain internal serenity or samatha. Okay, so then the Buddha sort of summarizes and says that he's taught the one absorbed in learning, the one absorbed in teaching, in recitation, in thinking and reflection, and the one who dwells, who truly dwells in the Dhamma. I'm having trouble scrolling down. Okay, so then he says, whatever should be done by a compassionate teacher out of compassion for his disciples, seeking their welfare, that I have done for you. Here are the roots of trees, empty huts, meditate. Do not be heedless. Do not have cause to regret it later. That's my instruction to you, to you. Okay, so this is number 73. Then we come to 74, and again, the entire framework is exactly the same, except here we have just a difference in one phrase. So here, let us just take the last example. The one who dwells the Dhamma, who dwells in the Dhamma, is one who learns the Dhamma and maybe teaches it to others, recites it, mentally investigates it, but he goes further and understands its meaning with wisdom. So it's not explicitly said here in the sutta, but I think this is explained in the commentary. The commentary says, beyond his learning, this is the one who understands the Dhamma with wisdom, would be the one who understands the meaning of that Dhamma by the wisdom of the path together with insight, one who sees and penetrates the Four Noble Truths. And so this sutta would be indicating the practitioner who emphasizes the development of insight or wisdom. And so because we have these two suttas, paired suttas here, it seems that each is directed towards one of two types of practitioners that we find both mentioned in the early discourses and throughout the development of Buddhist history. So we have a kind of practitioner who emphasizes the development of samatha, samadhi, who first develops strong samadhi and then develops insight on the basis of that samadhi, particularly the one who will develop the jhanas and the formless meditations, and then develops insight on the basis of the jhanas or the formless meditations. So this comes to be called the summit, in later Buddhism, it comes to be called the samatha yanika. And then the other practitioner doesn't place as much emphasis on the development of samadhi. So of course, to develop insight, you need some degree of concentration. But this practitioner approaches the practice through developing strong mindfulness, cultivating strong mindfulness on the ever-changing flow of phenomena, the ever-changing process of phenomena, and through attending mindfully to the changing process of phenomena, the rise and passing of material and mental phenomena, one develops a certain degree of concentration sufficient for insight to arise. And this practitioner comes to be called the vipassana yanika, or the one, the vipassana yanika, the one who makes insight the vehicle. So we have the contrast, the samatha yanika emphasizes the development of strong concentration. And then based on that concentration, one develops insight. The vipassana yanika proceeds or starts off the practice maybe with some degree of concentration, but then uses a strong development of mindfulness, probably through the 4 foundations of mindfulness, to develop insight sufficient for the path and fruition to be attained. Okay, so maybe this will do as a basic introductory presentation. Maybe now we can see if there are any questions. And those online can pose the question by using the hand symbol. And people here in person don't have to use the hand symbol. They can use a real hand. I haven't seen a real hand in ages. Let me make sure that my eyesight is. Okay, Regina.
I have a question regarding this. Steve and I were actually talking about this on the way up.
Yeah, wait, let Jason give you the microphone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bhante. And I have to say, it's wonderful to be here in person.
Good.
So those of you who are online and live in the area, come on down next time.
Wait, do the people online hear Regina?
Sort of.
Can you hear me now?
Not really good, Bhante.
Not distinctly.
Let me see if I put.
Is this going?
Let me put the microphone in.
The computer.
Bhante, maybe you can repeat the question so that way we can all hear it.
How do you hear?
We can hear you.
You can hear me. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, we can't hear her.
Okay, maybe I'll just have to rephrase. But the first thing she said was that she said it's really wonderful to be back in the class in person. And so she encourages those who have come in online, but who live in the vicinity to make the effort to come.
So my question regarding these 2 practitioners, we were talking about Mahasi Sayadaw, the book, the Direct Path to Insight. Which of these two practitioners, would you say it's the first or the second that would describe his approach?
Okay, so she's asking of these two modes. Are you hearing me, people online?
Yes, Bhante, we can hear you.
Okay. So her question is that I spoke about these two modes of practice. And so she's asking which mode of practice does the system taught by Mahasi Sayadaw fit into? Is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah, Mahasi Sayadaw is actually the one who has sort of revived and popularized the method of the Vipassana Yanika, the method of the straight insight. Because his approach, he doesn't utilize the development of strong samadhi, but he teaches that one goes directly into mindfully noting first, like the rising and falling of the abdomen, and then making mental notes about everything that one is experiencing as one is sitting. Of course, one uses an anchor object, which in the Mahasi system is the rise and fall of the abdomen. But then whatever you experience, if you hear sounds like dogs barking, you know, hearing. If you feel pain, say in the legs, you feel, you know, pain. If some kind of wandering thoughts arise, some angry thoughts, you know, anger, some tingling sensation, you know, tingling. And then you go back repeatedly to the rise and fall of the abdomen. Yeah, so that's the Mahasi system. But what I found with the practice of the Mahasi system, as I indicated, that though it doesn't encourage the development of the jhanic type of samadhi, but through this mindful noting of whatever is occurring, as one practices this over like days and even weeks, it builds up a force of, I would call it samadhi, so that one is really able to focus on whatever is happening just with each passing moment, so that the mind doesn't move away from the flow of experience. It's following whatever is occurring, but it's not focused on one single object to the exclusion of other objects, which is what happens in the jhanic type of samadhi. Okay, now Stephen.
Thank you, Bhante. My question is actually specifically about the word seclusion in this text.
Yeah.
And I think we've been thinking this morning to refer to physical separating out
Yeah.
of the person in a formal meditation practice. But I wonder if it also could be taken in a more perhaps metaphorical sense of a seclusion from sensuality.
Yeah.
Like I think we see that sometimes with the phrase quite secluded and sensual. But
Okay, that's a good point. So let me repeat the question. So this is Stephen. He's asking about the word that's translated here as seclusion. So he said the way I explained it, like resorting to a sort of secluded room or cottage, that I was taking it in the sense of physical seclusion. So he's wondering whether it can also refer to an inner seclusion, specifically seclusion from sensuality. And in fact, there is in the commentaries, which I think are drawing upon an older strata of canonical texts, a distinction made between three types of seclusion. Let me see if I can write these in, type these in.
आपके हाथ कट गया.
Okay, anyway, okay, we have Kaya Viveka, Chitta Viveka, And then the third one should be Upadhi Viveka, but I lost the typing
All
box.
got here.
Okay, sit down and start looking for.
Yeah, I hear some people talking. Please, if you want to talk.
I'm in the middle of work here
No,
outside.
that is not important. This is very important.
Okay, I think I got that. Okay, so we have a distinction made between three types of viveka. So kaya viveka is bodily seclusion. So that's usually taken to be the first stage, the first step. So in order to develop the mind, you have to go into some kind of physical seclusion. But actually now when we have like group meditation in a hall, since we're sort of each sitting in our own little space, even though other people will be sitting behind us or next to us, but we could say that is bodily seclusion, since we're not engaged in talking to others, engaging actively in relations with others. So this is bodily seclusion. And mental seclusion is the seclusion of the mind from disturbing thoughts, volatile emotions, especially from the 5 hindrances. So that would be like the preparatory stage for the jhanas, and also include the seclusion that is obtained through the jhanas. And then the Upadhi Viveka is the seclusion from, you could say, from all defilements. This is like the seclusion that takes place when the defilements are eradicated, cut off right at the root. In other words, this would be like the attainment of Nibbana while alive. Okay, so now we can take questions that come online. And I think the speaker is working here, so let me get the participant list. Okay, I see anyway 2 hands. One is Acharya on the iPhone. Okay, Acharya on the iPhone. You have to unmute. Okay, we'll try to unmute. We'll go to Kat.
Hi,
No, thank you,
Bhante.
Bhante. I do not have a question. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, then you would remove the hand symbol. Okay, then Kat.
Hi, Bhante. I have a question, not regard to the text, but regard to the meditation earlier. I am new, but so then when I meditate or every time I meditate, I feel some kind of like a goosebump, kind of like an electric wave go through it
Yeah.
a few times. So should I be bothering about it, or what would be your advice for it?
Yeah, don't pay any attention to that. I mean, that is good, but just don't give any attention to it. Just go back to your to the primary object.
Thank you, Bhante.
Okay, Tian Xiong.
Good morning, Bhante.
Good morning.
Referring to Sutta 73, you mentioned that it's mainly for samatha practice. But in the statement, you also mentioned that do not be heedless. So referring to this statement, do not be heedless, isn't that also refer to mindfulness kind of training? Thank you.
Well, of course, to develop, whether to develop samatha or insight, for both of them, you need mindfulness. But I think this statement, do not be heedless, yeah, he's saying do not engage in pamada. Pamada is what we translate as heedlessness. It means don't be In effect, don't be lazy, don't be negligent, but arouse your energy, your mindfulness, your diligence, your dedication. I don't think it has to be interpreted in terms of one particular quality or one particular practice, but it's just a general instruction to arouse your energy, to arouse energy in the development of mindfulness, not being lazy, negligent, slack in one's practice. Okay, so now we'll take, and if you finish the question like Kat, then you would remove the hand. Okay, Roman?
Bhante, can you speak a little about relevance of memorization for a lay practitioner is in modern times? Because it's not often emphasized, but I found for myself almost out of desperation a need to memorize certain things, for example, 32 parts of the body or some words of the Buddha.
Yeah, I think it's always very good to memorize texts. I have to confess I'm not very good at memorization myself. Back years ago, I used to do a fair amount of memorization. But in later years, because I've engaged in a lot of written work, so my devotion to memorization has slacked off. But it's very, very useful to practice, to memorize certainly certain basic texts. Like I encourage lay people to memorize, we call these the 3 blessing suttas. The Metta Sutta, the Sutta on loving kindness, the Mangala Sutta, the great discourse on blessings, the Ratana Sutta, the Sutta on the praise of the 3 jewels, and any other sutta that you find that you're attracted to, inspired by. And when you memorize a text and then you recite it from memory, you get a certain kind of inspiration and delight that you simply don't get from reading the text in the book.
Thank you, Bhante.
Yeah, so especially if you're young, then the mind is sharp and clear, you can memorize fairly well. And, as for this memorization, monks in the traditional, Theravadan countries with the Pali texts, in Tibet with the Tibetan scriptures, probably also in China with the Chinese texts, always they've practiced memorization and recitation from memory. And I remember years ago, this was 2006, when my own ordination teacher, the Venerable Balangoda Ananda Maitreya, when he was a young monk, his teacher made him memorize many, many texts. And so he memorized, I think, the entire, at least a whole Nikaya, I think was the Samyutta Nikaya. And later he was learning English, trying to learn English. And the way he learned English was with his little bit of English, he established a correspondence with, I think it was with Mrs. Rhys Davids, the co-founder of the Pali Text Society, or maybe it was I.B. Horner, her successor. And I think it was Mrs. Rhys Davids, in the 1920s. And she sent my teacher the English translation of the Samyutta Nikaya, and he memorized it, memorized it in English. And that was the way he developed a very good style of English. Yeah, but there are monks, especially in Burma, who make it their task to memorize entire Nikaya, and some monks memorize the entire Tripitaka. And when I was visiting Sri Lanka in the year 2006, at that time Sri Lanka was holding like a big international Buddha's birthday, the Vesak celebration. And so there were monks from other countries came. And one of the monks from Burma was they call a Tripitaka Dara, one who has memorized the entire Pali Canon.
Okay.
Yeah, and what actually this is what I found years ago when I was doing memorization, that when you begin, it's very, very difficult because the mind is not trained in that way. We rely so much on reading and exposure to written text and on literary ways of communication that we lose that capacity, the retentive capacity of the mind. But in traditional cultures, which are not so much text-based, it's much easier for them to memorize texts. And when you're young, especially, that's why they ordain in countries like Sri Lanka and Burma, where they ordain boys when they're still young teenagers, 13, 14 years old, ordain them as monks. Sometimes we object and say they shouldn't be ordained so young, wait till they get to their 20s to ordain them. But when they ordain at that young age, the mind is very fresh, and so they can learn the text fairly well by memorization. Once you get into the late 20s, early 30s, then it becomes a challenge. And when you get to be old, like in your 40s or 50s, but some people do it, some people do it. Yes, please.
And a very important way to understand that that's the reason that they're written that way, because of that practice.
You mean why there's so much repetition?
Yeah, so we'll like repeat the same formula, but then kind of go one thing at a time.
Yeah. So he's asking, is it because of this sort of tradition of memorization and recitation from memory that the printed version of the text have so much repetition in them? So you might say, okay, the Buddha says, contemplate amongst the 5 aggregates as impermanent, dukkha, non-self. Contemplate the aggregate of form as impermanent, dukkha, non-self. Contemplate the aggregate of feeling, like that. Yeah, but even in the printed text now, because I guess those who are writing them, even in fairly ancient times and with the printed editions, they don't want to print the repetition so much. And so the way it will be printed now, you'll have the full formula spelled out for the first item and usually for the last item. And then for the intermediate items, there's a word peyala, which is often abridged to pay, P-E. So you get like, with regard to form, pay, with regard to perception, pay, with regard to the volitional formations, pay. The pay means just repeat everything that was said earlier. But when one is learning the text by memorization and then reciting by memorization, then it's expected that you fill out everything. And that also serves, it might seem like pointless repetition, but it serves to strongly impress the ideas on the mind. When you get anicca, dukkha, anatta repeated 5 times instead of just twice, it gets really driven into the mind. Yeah, maybe give the microphone.
I have been chanting the mantra from childhood in Sri Lanka twice a day, and I still remember in my 70s. With the month chant, I don't need a book.
Yeah.
But you learn from childhood, you learn from it.
Yeah. He said that he's from Sri Lanka, so he said he had memorized these texts in his childhood, and so now he doesn't need to consult a book to know them, since they remain sort of imprinted on his memory, in his memory. And another thing about memorization, even though the sutta that we read seems to make a distinction between devoting one's time to memorization and recitation and the practice of meditation, but actually the practice of memorizing a text and then reciting it from memory does facilitate the development of strong mindfulness and also I would say concentration, because when you're reciting the text, you have to learn it by memory, and the word, actually the Pali word for memory, is the same word that is translated as mindfulness. The word is sati. So the original meaning of sati was remembrance, remembering. And so when you have to train the mind to remember something and to go over it again and again, the mind becomes very sort of still, quiet, attentive to what one is reciting, and it builds up the capacity for that ability to be able to home in on one's immediate experience and to develop a kind of samadhi. Yeah, so even I would say that there's a kind of recitation samadhi, a concentration that builds up through recitation, repeated recitation. So then when you sit for meditation, it becomes relatively easy to collect the mind and focus it. Okay, let us see if we have some more questions. Okay, one is from Kevin. Again, you lower the hand.
Hi, Bhante. Thank you for teaching. I'm curious about this division between samatha and vipassana in the suttas here. I'm wondering, do you think that since these two suttas are back to back, is the Buddha emphasizing them equally, or saying that they can be an either or type of thing? You can choose to focus one or over the other. And also curious how we make the move, how do we understand discernment as vipassana, as it's just saying discerning? Why do we take that to mean that the vipassana process?
Okay, we have two questions here. Okay, as the first question, I would say that there's a difference in emphasis of the two suttas. Perhaps, as I said, because practitioners have different dispositions, different inclinations. In the suttas, we don't find these terms that I mentioned earlier, samatha yanika and vipassana yanika. They're not explicitly mentioned, but there is some suttas in which the Buddha speaks about some practitioner who easily gains samatha, but doesn't easily gain vipassana. And then the Buddha says that practitioner should make the effort to acquire the ability in vipassana. And then the other practitioner is naturally skilled in vipassana, but doesn't easily gain samatha. So that one should make the effort to also to train in samatha. So both qualities are essential, but I would say that practitioners have different aptitudes, different skills, different inclinations. So I'm saying perhaps the Buddha spoke these two suttas in order to address the inclinations of those two types of disciples. But alternatively, we could also see that the Buddha might be, by giving these two suttas, trying to emphasize the need for both internal serenity of mind and this examination of the meaning and penetrating it with wisdom. And then the question about discernment, how discernment leads to vipassana, was that the question?
Yeah, in the sutta, he simply says discern. And I know in other places, discernment is related to insight into the Four Noble Truths. I'm just wondering how do we know that when he says discernment, that means the process of vipassana?
Yeah, in that case, I would have to say, what is the Pali word that is being rendered as discernment? Because the discernment could mean also like something that results from intellectual reflection, but also something that comes through direct insight. So I would say that it is direct insight that is what constitutes vipassana properly. But for vipassana to arise, there has to be mindful, the application of mindfulness to the changing process of experience, and then discernment of what is occurring from moment to moment. And it is that discernment, that clear seeing of what is happening from moment to moment, that brings actual insight or deeper insight into the arising and passing away of phenomena. I don't know if does that answer the question?
It does. Thank you, Bhante.
Okay. Okay, the next question is from Yong.
Thank you, Bhante. I recite the ending of the sutta a lot.
You what?
The ending of the sutta,
Yeah.
meditate, do not be heedless.
Yeah.
But I have been wondering why the ending is, this is not my instruction to you. Instead, it's our instruction. Does it mean Sangha?
No. Yeah. So the question is why the sutta uses the plural form. This is our instruction to you, rather than the singular. This is my instruction to you. I think this is there's an expression, I think it must be of British origin, called the royal plural, the royal we. So it's, the Buddha is really indicating this is my instruction to you, but it's an elevated or elegant way of saying that.
I see. Thank you,
But he's really
Bhante.
indicating himself. It's not the instruction coming from a group of people, but that's the Buddha's own instruction. Okay, we could take one more question. And this is a live question. Yenny, is that? Yenny. Okay, take the microphone.
So, Bhante, from your explanation just now, you said that samatha and vipassana have to be, the monks have to practice both of them, like vipassana and samatha. But for someone who wants to attain sotapanna, want to train to be a sotapanna, can it be done just only by practicing vipassana, but not samatha? Or it has to be both?
Okay, so she's asking, in order to achieve stream entry or sotapatti, is it possible to skip over samatha and just practice exclusively vipassana? Okay, this is my opinion. To gain stream entry, and I would say probably the stage of once returner, maybe even the stage of non-returner, it's not necessary to attain the jhanas, to develop samatha to the level of jhanas. But when one is practicing this method of what's called dry insight, the method promulgated by Mahasi Sayadaw, teachers in his lineage like U Pandita Sayadaw and so on, as one is developing mindfulness through insight, through intensive mindfulness, one reaches a level of concentration that corresponds to roughly to the jhanic level of concentration, even though one is not going into one-pointed absorption on a single object, as in the samatha type of approach. So the mind becomes unwaverably unshakably fixed upon the ever-changing process of experience. And I would say that that can be considered a kind of samatha, the samatha sufficient. Okay, so it's on the basis of that kind of samatha that insight, actual insight arises. And so you do have, in that case, a samatha and vipassana joined together, operating together. And that is sufficient to bring the attainment of stream entry. Okay, I'm going to have to end now since I'll have to go up for the meal. And so we'll end now with the sharing of the merits. Okay. Again, it's a new learning experience doing all of this in person. Maybe a matter of reviving. See, I have poor memory. It's just 3 years ago that we stopped doing this, and 3.5 years ago. And now it seems like I'm learning all over again. Okay, so we're going to do the sharing of the merits. So we share the merits with the devas, the Dhamma protecting deities, the nagas, the dragon spirits, the fair spirits, and so on. Asking them to protect the Dhamma, to protect the world, especially to protect this world from violence and climate devastation, and to protect, to preserve a livable planet and a peaceful world. Akasata Jabumata Deva Nagamahidika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Sasanang. Akasata Jabumata Deva Nagamahidika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Desanang. Akasata Jabumata Deva Nagamahidika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Mang Parang. Dukha Pata Chani Dukha Baya Pata Chani Baya Soka Pata Chani Soka Antu Sabepi Panino. May those in suffering be free from suffering. May those in fear be free from fear. May those in sorrow be free from sorrow. May all living beings also be thus. We go sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Sadhu, sadhu,
And now we can do
Thank you, Bhante.
We have
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you.
three
Thank
bows.
you, Bhante.
Thank you,
Good to see you,
Bhante.
Bhante. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
and now
you.
we have three.
Enjoy the
Bows
lunch.
to the Buddha.
We
3
have a
bows
real
to the
Buddha
Buddha.
here. A real Buddha.
3 bows to the Buddha.
Bow to the Buddha.
Thank you, Bhante.
Not just an
Thank you,
imaginary,
Bhante.
a real Buddha.
Yeah, the real Buddha.
Mhm. Mm. Mm.
You
Mm.
see the real Buddha?
No.
The background is not clear, Bhante.
I see. Okay, you can change the view mode.
It's okay.
So it's not the blurry.
Thank you, Bhante.
Oh, it's okay now. It's
that's
okay now. We can see the Buddha. Yeah.
A real
Perfect.
Buddha. Okay.
Okay.
Mhm. 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 Oh.
2, 3.
And a bow to Bhante.
Okay.
Bow to Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Bhante.
Bhante. Enjoy the lunch.
Thank you,
Care,
Bhante.
Bhante. Thank you,
Bhante.
Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank
Everyone,
you.
Charanai, Namo Buddhaya.
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante. Take care. Be safe. See you on Wednesday.
Okay.
Thanks, Bhante.
Just end this. Okay.
Have a good lunch.
Sadhu.